So, Marvel movies, you may have heard of them, especially with Avengers Endgame coming in with the biggest weekend box office draw of all time. Here I'm looking at how Marvel movies, specifically in their own cinematic universe, the MCU, have changed over time.
Your monster attacked my monster.
Unlike other iterations of the Changed Over Time series, I'm not going to address every single movie. I'll show you the box office details of them, but with 22 movies released since 2008, I'm going to parse things out the same way Marvel has, into phases, from the first Iron Man movie all the way to Endgame. In the last decade, played out through these phases, we can see a consistent tone emerge, how the studio planned for the future, and how growth has become organic and careful. And just to be clear, before we start, I'm not going to spoil anything here, or really talk about the plots of the movies in question. And I think I should say right now that I am not a fan of Marvel beyond being a casual viewer. I'm interested because the MCU is so clearly reflective of US and Western culture, and I'm interested in how the series was curated from a production standpoint. But with that, we start with the most exciting of all movie subjects, something that all moviegoers can agree is the most enthralling, invigorating, and sexy facet of movies: financing. There are some very thorough rundowns and dissections of Marvel's history out there, I'm sure, and while I'm not going to give you a history of Marvel, let me give you a quick rundown on how Marvel Studios is structured and how it came to be. Marvel began life as Timely Comics in 1939. Marvel Studios was established as Marvel Films in 1993, changing its name in 1996. For the 2 decades before that, Marvel has been optioning its characters and stories. Now, when people talk about licensing or selling, rights to a script or to characters, or the right to adapt a novel, they're really talking about transferring rights to a producer, enabling them to go and make the film. Optioning is more or less selling someone the right to maybe, possibly make a film, usually within a time limit. Specifically, it's selling the right to exclusive purchase. A typical example would be a producer buying not the rights to use a character in a film, but paying for the exclusive right to buy those rights at a later point, as long as they do so in 18 months or 5 years, or whatever the deal is. The reason I'm telling you this is optioning isn't exactly high status. It's the sort of thing you do where the producer says, we'd love to make your film maybe if the other producer likes it, and if we can get an actor, and if we can get the money, and if the planets align. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's a humble place to start, and I think that's interesting for a franchise that is now essentially dripping in gold. But as well as optioning being a way to, I suppose comparatively to Marvel's success these days, get by, it also was important, alongside Marvel's continued creation and expansion of its source material, i.e. the comics, in maintaining an audience.
Hey, look! That nutty machine of his really worked!
Or really, permeating into the culture of more than one generation. What I mean is, Marvel may not have been, until fairly recently, such an emblem of popular culture, but it has been around for generations, and it's never left the collective cultural psyche. Being established so long ago, but continuing to option and then later more meaningfully license their properties, has allowed Marvel to cultivate an audience that in many ways wasn't really reaped until recent years. If you want to build a fan base, get them young. This also means that Marvel's climb was quite steady, and by the time licensing came to be, it was pretty solid. Blade might seem to be just a vampire action film, especially to anyone unfamiliar with comics, but Blade himself is a character established in the minds of audiences years before the film came out. This is something repeated for each MCU film, and something inevitably giving an advantage. Want to see a poppy vampire film with a character you grew up reading about, or want to see a poppy vampire film with an original story and characters you don't know? Blade was Marvel's first licensing venture in 1998, followed by X-Men in 2000. These films proved an interest in Marvel's property, an interest that wouldn't have been there without the groundwork. Not that it was originally intended to be groundwork. In 2003, film and play producer David Meisel approached Marvel with a plan to create a cinematic universe. Meisel ended up becoming the chief operating officer at Marvel Studios in 2004, itself a subsidiary of Marvel Entertainment until 2015. It was then CEO of Marvel Entertainment, Isaac Perlmutter, and the CEO of its subsidiary, Marvel Studios, Avi Arad, that took on Meisel and his plan.
You know, looking sort of the past 5 years at Marvel, there has been a lot of dynamic change. And frankly, a large part of it hasn't necessarily been caused by technology. It's been caused by a rethinking of our business model. You know, being a pure play intellectual property or brand company, a lot of factors allowed us to take more control of our destiny.
As we'll see, Kevin Feige is more or less the curator of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the hand steering the ship. But it is Perlmutter, Arad, and perhaps most of all Meisel who are the architects of it. Or look at it a different way. Those three men probably didn't sit around and say, let's work towards the Infinity Gauntlet. They probably didn't say, yeah, let's put this movie in Phase 3. But they did facilitate the existence of a Marvel-controlled, interconnected universe. Meisel raised $525 million through Merrill Lynch, putting up the rights of 10 of its characters as collateral. Here are the names on screen. Ooh, look at them all. In the mid-2000s, at the same time as doing that, Marvel sought to reclaim the rights to certain characters. As you can imagine, with all that licensing and optioning, it's a very complicated process, and it's still going on. There was, as I suppose is inevitable when you raise $500 million from not quite ready to crap its pants Merrill Lynch, umming and erring. Arad was pushed out in 2006 over disagreements about production decisions. Things were unclear for a time. Who would distribute? Would Marvel pay for their own drinks, or was it an open bar? Essentially, the makeup of Marvel, which is now entirely a subsidiary of Disney, is very complicated. Rights are constantly shifting, and even at times quite ambiguous. Despite that, in 2008, Marvel went ahead and released its first movie of its very own cinematic universe, the MCU.
And I learned a lot working on other films at other studios, other Marvel films at other studios up to that point. And when we got the chance to do it ourselves, there was a lot of pressure involved because it was all on us. But I was very comfortable with that because if we were to fail, at least we would have failed with the best intentions.
Iron Man stars Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark, a man with a hippie beard and a plan. Stark, a billionaire businessman and engineer, gets kidnapped by terrorists who want him to make a missile. Instead, he makes the Iron Man suit and henceforth outguns everything that moves. After that, Stark faces off a closer threat, questions the weapons industry from which much of the Stark fortune seems to have been made, and defies all to reveal himself as Iron Man. Iron Man cost $140 million to make and brought in $585 million. Not bad for a film about a character probably not as popular as, say, Spider-Man. I think that this proves that Marvel's strategy works. It's a strategy of measured release. I can't say how successful Iron Man would have been had the character only been invented for the first movie and had not been previously well established, but I don't think it's wrong to say a fan base who already love your repertoire of characters are far easier to mobilise than people who've never heard of this Iron Downey Jr. lad. Still, it would be hard to think of many studios who could resist going in harder. Iron Man sets up a universe to come, but it is a standalone film, and it doesn't introduce us to characters who have no part in the story. And this is where I want to properly introduce Kevin Feige. From what I can gather from interviews and from what Marvel insiders have said, Feige, the president of Marvel since 2007, is the person most responsible for how Marvel's cinematic universe has been rolled out, and how each outing has been approached. If Perlmutter, Arad and Meisel are the architects, Feig is the engineer.
The only thing we were thinking about, and even think about to this day, because it's the only thing we can control, is how will the audience respond on opening weekend. It's not about the numbers. It's not about the tracking. Other people can worry about that later in the process. We work on how will the audience respond on opening weekend.
Feig, in my view, did two things that allowed the Marvel Universe to endure. First, he allowed the shared universe to develop organically. Marvel certainly has adapted and refined along the way, but in a far less reactive and nervous way than, say, Disney's hold on Star Wars. Secondly, Marvel made their product accessible in any mode. You can be a diehard fan who knows all of the mythos, or you can be a complete newcomer. I think Feig achieved this by taking the time to consider what appeals to people about this genre.
Everything that's happening, the things that are about to come to light, people might just need a little old-fashioned.
Iron Man is like any piece of media. It's reflective. It reflects the times. The terrorists are Middle Eastern, not East German. There's an anxiety about terror and war and greed.
We're all a product of our time. I don't think we set out to make any overt political statements in our movies, but we're influenced by the world around us as we're sitting in a room developing the stories and creating the stories.
But also, Iron Man and all of the cinematic universe is not so interested in the politics of the day, but in the wielding of power. Or more specifically, the morality of power. People from Shakespeare to Orwell have written about this, and I'm not saying there's a hidden message behind the MCU or anything like that, but there certainly is exploration. From the very beginning, from Iron Man 1, Marvel have presented a recurring question about authority. If someone with power, but without mandate, can exercise that power for the greater good, should they exercise it? I think this idea, as well as the presentation of what might be called benevolent authority, the tantalizing dream of someone with power not abusing that power and even fighting those that do, I think that idea is really appealing to people and is why superheroes in general are popular. I think Kevin Feige worked that out or knew it all along, and he made that the spine of the Marvel body. This theme isn't just recurring in individual movies, it's overarching. The Avengers break up over disagreements about authority, whether the master of the masterless should be government or moral agency.
Oversight is not an idea that can be dismissed out of hand.
You chose to do that. If we sign this, we surrender our right to choose. What if this panel sends us somewhere we don't think we should go? What if there's somewhere we need to go and they don't let us?
And the ultimate fight, the end of the Infinity Saga, is all about standing up to the abuse of power. This theme is by no means exclusive to Marvel, but I think they got its handling and inclusion right. But I also want to note that this is very much in the source material. Captain America was born out of anxieties about the Second World War, and I don't think it's such a stretch to connect the very early 90s appearance of Thanos, a megalomaniac tyrant, with anxiety over the Cold War. The power to destroy half of the entire world, all at my fingertips. Dimitri.
Even below the surface, we're influenced by real life as we make these movies.
Feig has produced every MCU film and many others, and he's important not only to the direction of the shared universe, but to the tone of the films individually, more so than their directors. And Iron Man sets up that tone well. Not too heavy, and not always reliant on comedy. Unlike DC, which I think has established quite an introspective tone, perhaps even inadvertently, Iron Man and Marvel have a tone where tragedy and comedy can exist together. The tone persists through the entire series, and while there are fluctuations, especially in Marvel's first phase, especially when it was refining its formula, it never veers too greatly. A common criticism of Marvel, and of Iron Man 2, is that they're safe. And I agree. For my own personal tastes, I think all of Marvel films are a little bit too safe. But I also think that safety is a key component of why Marvel has been so successful. They present a place where there'll be some laughs, maybe some tears, and probably quite a bit of action. They have to package a lot of material for a large, popular audience, and I think they do it very carefully and very well. And really, the least safe film of the entire MCU is the fourth film, Thor, because it's so out there.
Pass the dutchie on the left hand side. Pass the dutchie on the left hand side.
They broke into the weapons vault. If the Frost Giants had stolen even one of these relics...
They didn't.
Well, I want to know why.
But the first Thor film was building on a foundation established by the previous 3 films. It might not sound important, but I think if the order of Phase 1 had begun with Thor, it would have been less successful. I mean this in terms of the average cinema goer, not fans, because they're coming anyway. From a producer point of view, it's the average cinema goer that you're trying to capture. And I mean this in a good way, from the outside, Thor looks kind of dorky.
I apologize.
But Iron Man is more accessible, maybe not in 2019, but certainly in 2008. However, after Iron Man and the Hulk, average cinema goers had a way better idea of what to expect. Again, this may sound obvious, but I think a lot of this does come back to Kevin Feige. He knew how to position these things, and he knew how to appeal to a general audience. I think Thor could have kind of scared some people off, and I think he knew that too. That's not to say they got everything right. The Incredible Hulk has Ed Norton as Bruce Banner, aka the Hulk, but he never returned to the role. Whether it was because of artistic differences, whatever that means, or the more likely situation that a contract could not be agreed upon, an actor playing a title character being replaced tells us something. It tells us that while Marvel and Disney executives probably did know where the cinematic universe was going, they didn't have 24 films penned in for distant release dates. They didn't sign a contract with Ed Norton for 6 films. They signed a contract with him for 1. And you can bet when they were entering Phase 2, they were locking people in. And while this might be a production / casting / contract error, it tells us they weren't counting their chickens before they hatch.
It takes him 3 hours to wake up, so there's like 3 hours of like problems, or like change this, change that, and everything. So then you can think about this part and remember the lines. And now,
What lines?
Phase 1 culminated in the Avengers, an ensemble of characters established in the previous 5 films, and with Mark Ruffalo replacing Ed Norton. That's what rage does to you. The Avengers made an incredible $1.5 billion, and it did that by being the film, and by being advertised as the film, that connects the threads established before. Phase 1 was therefore a success, with the first Avengers film blowing away any noise generated by the so-so performance of Captain America. Marvel didn't hit its filmmaking stride until the second film of the second phase.
Thank you for the commentary, Loki. It's not at all distracting.
Honestly, looking back at the Hulk and comparing it to recent efforts, it seems quite badly paced, and there are other moments in some of the early movies that seem quite unsure. I think humour was really important in making Iron Man successful, and in attracting people who weren't already fans. I think Marvel HQ realised that, and that's why it's such an important component in the series now. The second Thor film, Thor: The Dark World, is a far more carefully constructed movie. It might not poke fun at itself or have the same self-awareness as Thor Ragnarok, but it tightens some of the saggy bits of the previous phase. And it might sound like a weird thing to say, but I think it represents a point where Marvel could finally relax. The Dark World is a much more refined product than Thor: The Dutch Angle, and by this point the entire formula was pretty refined. Not to underplay the broad appeal of the first phase, but Phase 2 is where Marvel really became not just part of the mainstream, but a leader of it, and you can tell they were aware of that. The second phase's films feel less about trying to be big films and more about just getting on with it and doing their own thing. I personally feel that it's the second half of the second phase where the MCU crossed from being appealing to people who aren't necessarily into superhero movies to appealing to people who aren't necessarily into movies. Guardians of the Galaxy is funny. It's got cute stuff for the kids, but it's not a film about trucks that become robots that become fast food toys. It's not dumb, it's not impenetrable, and it's the sort of film you can just put on without worrying so much about what came before and after. Marvel never made their movies so thick with lore as to turn newcomers off, but I think films like Guardians and Ant-Man is really where Marvel began to cement itself as the sort of movie that anyone could watch, even the tweet while watching sort of viewer. I mean, look at the dates. If Phase 1 was the entirety of the universe, you might say that was a very successful series that was part of the late 2000s sort of mindset. But having now been around for a decade, I think it's safe to say that Marvel permeates itself into US and international culture. I'm trying to say that there's mainstream, but then there's so mainstream it sort of becomes the normal. The sort of thing that never emulates, but is constantly emulated. So with both the fans and the regular audience happy, and with these figures, I mean, look at these figures. All the production budgets are so much lower. I told you financing was the most exciting bit. With goodwill and figures, Marvel really started pumping things out in Phase 3. It feels rare that I get to the end of a series of films, or in this case, the end of a universe of films, and have positive things to say. But Phase 3 is my favourite phase. The films are lighter, Doctor Strange has a great beard, and there's a real honing, perhaps not of filmmaking, but certainly of production control. And that's not to put down any of the directors involved. Some, such as James Gunn, who directed the Guardians of the Galaxy films, certainly put their mark on the films they made. But they are Marvel movies.
I don't want to do it with Michael Rooker anymore. He's going to say something stupid. He's going to embarrass me.
They have a very consistent feel and tone. They look consistent too, certainly by Phase 3. Phase 3 really saw Marvel consolidate. It managed, with the foundations it has always been building, to make every film a tentpole. But also, Marvel has always made clear where it's going, without spoiling anything. The antagonist of what might not necessarily be the end of Phase 3, but is certainly the end of the Infinity Saga, and it basically is the end of Phase 3, was established well beforehand. Infinity War more or less sets up 2019's Avengers Endgame. Endgame, the second highest grossing film of all time after Avatar, although when I made this, it's still on in cinemas. I don't think it being the second or first highest grossing film of all time is important though. I think what's important is Endgame is the second highest grossing film of all time, but Infinity War, from only a year before, is the fifth. The Avengers is the seventh. Age of Ultron is the 9th. Black Panther is the 10th. In fact, out of the top 25 box office earners of all time, 8 are Marvel movies. All from the last 7 years. I think Endgame almost epitomises how this happened. I don't think Endgame is a very good film. It's not particularly bad. I wouldn't even call it a bad film. But it's not very good. But Marvel doesn't and shouldn't care what people like myself think. It's not about that. Marvel has never tried to make cinema as art. Endgame is a huge fan service, and for someone who didn't grow up with these characters and who really only knows about them from the 48 hours of runtime, it felt far more like the third act of a film, not a film itself. That to me isn't good, but for fans I think it was what was wanted and what was needed. Marvel's presence in the childhoods of people who now have disposable cash is the bedrock of Marvel, but I think that would be irrelevant if they had lost sight of themselves and their objectives. I'm not going to say that fans matter to Marvel more than anything. Let's be real, this is a business. Margins matter. But I think fans do matter to Marvel, not only because that of course affects sales, but also, I think quite clearly, the decision makers themselves are fans of the source material. That's not always the case, especially with franchises. Again, that goes back to Kevin Feige, but also the people chosen for crucial positions. James Gunn for one, but also the concept artists and designers who translated print to film.
Even sometimes even before there's a script, we're like designing characters, we're designing scenes to help inspire the directors, the producers, to kind of help visualize what the movie can look like.
The ride isn't over, and although decline might be inevitable, I don't think it will be graceless or even very soon. Although Endgame was climactic, I don't think Marvel will struggle to come back from that, especially as they now have in their reach previously inaccessible rights. The X-Men, Fantastic Four, and the continuation of Spider-Man, and so much more, really could mean they have another decade at the top, and it's very difficult for me to even guess at the genre that will succeed superheroes as the mainstream staple. There is still a lot of life in the superhero genre, and while there is, Marvel will always be king, and Disney will always be emperor. There's a lot I haven't mentioned, many movies, but that's all I have to say on how Marvel has changed. It started out a little wobbly, but sincere. It wasn't trying to set the Avengers up in film 2, it wasn't positioning itself as being an epic before it actually was an epic. It refined itself in its second phase, and it never stopped refining itself. It was guided by people who knew and appreciated the source material. With its massive back catalogue of characters, I think Marvel has always felt like it was building something of its own making, not looking for anything that might be big. Really, Marvel presents a clear roadmap on how to do it. It's like making wine. Don't be greedy. Don't water things down. If you make one case that's good, don't make 3 with the same amount of effort. Care about each vine. Wait 70 years.